Diane, I have a very complex story to tell you, so I did something uncharacteristic and wrote the whole thing out in advance. It is as follows. For my latest assignment, I am investigating a certain religious group. Since this tape will be made public, I am not going to mention the group's name, but I think you know which one I'm talking about. As I told you, one of the last times we saw each other, I hold a tremendous respect for the leader of this religion, whom I will be referring to only as S.H. Ever since I first looked into S.H.'s artwork and history, I was overcome with the unshakable feeling that S.H. and I shared a sort of connection, and I was continuously surprised by the increasing number of very concrete similarities, almost as if we had been living parallel lives. Some of these striking coincidences include the following. In our early 20s, S.H. and I both shaved one half of our heads, and we wore the same style of aviator glasses. Around this time, we were both extremely depressed. S.H. got down on his knees and prayed to a God he did not believe in to give him a sign that this God existed, and that life was meaningful, that there was a reason for living. Much like S.H., I wrote a poem in which I essentially asked God to do the same thing for me. It even included the phrase, "Please, God I don't believe in, wake me up, slap me in the face." According to S.H., the very next day, they were offered Obical-P for the first time. S.H. had beautiful visions and seemingly prophetic thoughts that changed his life, Diane. And on the same night, he claims to have met the love of his life. Just a few days after writing the aforementioned poem, I also took Obical-P. Unlike S.H., it wasn't my first time, but for some reason, this trip was different. I've already tried to describe the numerous epiphanies I had that night to you, Diane. When I look back on it now, I see that my excited ramblings must not have been entirely comprehensible to you. At the time, I was under the impression that I was enlightened and that my life would be a breeze from there on out. At the time, you humored me and seemed excited to help, which now I wish you hadn't done. I wish you had been honest with me, Diane, because you know I would have listened. But anyway, I'm getting off topic. Returning to the parallels between me and S.H., I didn't meet the love of my life that night. In fact, I lost the person who I thought would be the love of my life. However, both of us did experience dramatic, life-changing alterations in our love lives, which I believe to be another important parallel. Also, S.H.'s and my trip in question were very similar, so much so that we even saw the exact same visual hallucinations. This I know because S.H. drew detailed depictions of his, which I only saw after I had mine, so I know that my hallucinations weren't just a reflection of his paintings. Of course, I wasn't the only one who had a parallel experience to S.H. in this regard. Thousands of people saw his paintings and connected with them, and that's why he's so famous. But as I told you, my connection with S.H. seemed more specific, less universal, more personal in a way. I had heard a song called History Repeats Itself sometime before my big trip, as I like to call it, which I believe I shared with you. Instead of describing it to you, I feel the song speaks for itself, so I'll play it now.
Glory, glory, hallelujah, His truth is marching on.
This is a strange but true story which proves that history does repeat itself, and the events depicted here happened just 100 years apart. Both President Lincoln and President Kennedy were concerned with the issue of civil rights. Lincoln was elected in 1860. Kennedy was elected in 1960, 100 years apart. Both were shot from behind in the head. Their successors, both named Johnson, were Southern Democrats with seats in the Senate. Andrew Johnson was born in 1808. Lyndon Johnson was born in 1908, 100 years apart. John Wilkes Booth, the man that shot Lincoln, was born in 1839. Lee Harvey Oswald, the man that shot Kennedy, was born in 1939, 100 years apart. Booth and Oswald were Southerners, favoring unpopular ideas. Booth and Oswald were both assassinated before going to trial. Both presidents' wives lost children through death while in the White House. Both presidents were killed on a Friday and in the presence of their wives. President Lincoln's secretary, whose name was Kennedy, advised him not to go to the theater. President Kennedy's secretary, whose name was Lincoln, advised him not to go to Dallas. John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln in a theater and ran to a warehouse. Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy from a warehouse and ran to a theater. The names Lincoln and Kennedy each contain 7 letters. The names Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Johnson each contain 15 letters. The names John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald each contain 15 letters. And friends, it is true. History does repeat itself.
His truth is marching on.
This song inspired me to play around with a few calculations relating to SH and I, not thinking anything would come of it. And it turns out SH and I, who both chose our own names, by the way, both have the same number of letters in our names. It also occurred to me that Donald Trump and Adolf Hitler's names both contain the same number of letters. As a side note, I think it's important to add that I didn't find these coincidences after a long list of calculations. These were literally the first names I thought to check. Finally, I calculated the number of years in between SH and Hitler, 74, and the number of years between myself and Trump, 47. Dianne, I don't know if any of these similarities are meaningful, but as usual, my policy is to share every little bit of information with you, however insignificant it may seem at the time. And thus concludes the series of circumstances that led me to believe I had a special connection to SH, and I wondered if he would feel it too. I sent him an email detailing what I just described to you, and asking how I could get involved in his organization, but I never received a response. I thought I had done all I could do, until months later when a new friend of mine, Jay, mentioned that he had just come from one of SH's monthly gatherings. Another interesting coincidence surrounding how I met Jay. I'm not sure exactly when we met because, from the first time I can remember, I experienced extremely strong déjà vu every time I saw him. Anyway, although I knew that SH owned a chapel, it never occurred to me to actually just go there. I assumed one had to be involved in the church's mission in some way. But as luck would have it, it turned out that we could all just buy tickets, and the church happened to be less than 2 hours away. Jay, Nikita, and I all agreed to go to the next event, though we didn't know what would take place there. I got out of work the afternoon of the event, and we worked on our costumes. Since the event was supposed to be masquerade, the costumes were important. I don't like wearing masks for the same reason I prefer not to wear sunglasses. I'd rather not have anything obscure my expressions. Human communication is already so delicate, Dianne, so I always do my best to eliminate any factors that might confuse the situation. But I painted my face extravagantly to make up for the lack of a mask. I decided a normal eye would be too cheesy, so I painted on an Ivy Adams-style anime eye hanging out of its socket by just a thread. I wore that bathing suit I have that depicts the person's internal organs as a nod to SH's art. Over that I wore black leather pants, combat boots, a fake fur vest, and over the whole thing, a giant hooded black trench coat with a pink and purple wolf's head stitched onto the back, with various other patches that fit with the futuristic yet tribal aesthetic. I stitched a real animal face onto my hood so that it flopped over my face. Nikita wore a bee-patterned dress, lots of yellow makeup, and space tights, and Jay dressed as a pirate zombie. Nikita and I took our Obical P at home, and were already starting to feel the effects on the ride. I kept imagining the cars as cartoon characters with headlights as the eyes, and wondering if they had been designed that way, specifically to be appealing to us humans, because we enjoy reflections of ourselves. On the way there, I got to know Jay a little better and find him to be a very beautiful, very high being, as expert Ram Dass would put it. very charismatic, and definitely a potential member of our organization. After a 2-hour car ride, we got there at 8 o'clock p.m. The men who directed us to our parking place had an extremely serious police-like air about them, dressed in black uniforms, gear belts, certainly not what one would expect from any music festival or other hippie gathering. Nikita was still doing Jay's makeup in the car, but I had to relieve myself, so I elected to go in early and meet up with my friends once inside. After a long walk across an unlit, muddy path through the woods, I was starting to think that perhaps I was going the wrong way, because there were no markers of any kind. However, I spotted a couple who seemed to know where they were going, and followed them. When I saw the mansion up the hill, the first thing that came to my mind was the Disney Castle logo. The pastel-colored lights and the symmetrical yet whimsical architecture gave the place a magical aura I had never experienced in real life before, only in movies and music videos. I'm sure I would have been more awestruck if the urge to relieve myself hadn't been so pressing, but for the time being, all I could think about was finding a bathroom. I provided my name to 2 secretaries sitting at a table in front of the doorway. They instructed me to take my shoes off before going inside. I entered a room crowded with guests in elaborate costumes, as if I had walked in on a costume ball from both the past and the future at once. Nobody spoke above a whisper, due to some unspoken rule. I stood in the long line for the bathroom, looking at the colorful lights and sacred geometry, trying to figure out how much of it was actually there and how much was the result of my trip. I had assumed that everyone there would feel some kind of automatic spiritual bond, and I was a little let down to see how guarded and shy people seemed. But I tried not to let this negative first impression color my perception of the whole place. After all, I've found it's always a good policy to allow people and places multiple first impressions, just in case the initial feeling happened to be a fluke. After what seemed like an eternity, I used the restroom, and exited to find Jay and Nikita. Now the whole unrealness of the place was really starting to set in. It reminded me of those scenes from the Hunger Games where the main characters witnessed the lavish lifestyle of the upper class. I had just assumed that SH's clear window into the divine universe, seeing God, etc., would come with generosity and a rejection of materialism. But the more I looked around me, the more one thing stuck out. Sure, it was beautiful, but it was all just a hustle. Even if SH himself wasn't aware of that on a conscious level, that's what this religion had turned into, the perfect machine for creating art for profit. It baffles me that I didn't realize it before, because now when I look back at their website, there are so many glaringly obvious signs. I guess at the time I was so sure that SH and I were going to be exactly alike that I neglected to notice our obvious differences. When I found Nikita, it was clear she felt the same way. We looked around for some free food, but amidst all the lavish displays of wealth, nothing was being given away. I ended up buying a bowl of vegan chili, and Nikita sat next to me smoking a cigarette. People started to gather around this stage-like area in the center of the house. SH and their partner with the same initials were sitting in throne-like chairs at the front, giving a presentation. SH told the same story I had heard him tell on YouTube, about taking Obicalp for the first time, subsequently meeting the love of his life, etc. Then they listed all sorts of accomplishments their church had made, which consisted of creating beautiful and expensive and impressive artworks, and they talked about the expensive and impressive additions they needed to add to fulfill their vision. When the speech was over, we were free to enjoy the various attractions around the mansion: belly dancing, live painting, a dance party, fire jugglers, a giant dome with kaleidoscopic patterns projected onto the ceiling. Nikita and I aimlessly wandered from room to room, trying to enjoy the show, but it was so crowded we kept getting swept along from one side of the house to another and back again. I had brought a painting, that big abstract one I did during my big trip, to give to SH. Back in the main room, SH and their partner were chatting with guests. I didn't know what I was going to say. After all, what does one say to one's doppelganger? I tapped him on his shoulder and said, "Do you recognize me?" I knew it was a stupid question, but I was curious. He searched my face for a while, trying to pin down where he had seen me somewhere before, as I searched for the words to explain to him that actually we had never met. I forget exactly how I phrased it, but in the end I did tell him about everything, our parallel lives, and how I thought we had a connection. He responded in a careful, practiced way, trying not to step on any toes. I can't remember his exact words, but I felt like he thought I was there for a token sentence of sagacious wisdom, and he was trying to deliver exactly the right product to fit my requirements. He talked about the universal connection that unites us all, but it was hard to follow because although he sounded very wise, saying all the right words, making all the right gestures, everything he had to say was entirely open-ended, nothing specific or conclusive about him or me. At one point he asked us how we were enjoying the party, and I told him that everything was beautiful, which it undeniably was, but that I felt like it was a little fake, and did he know what I meant? He said that yes, it was fake to a certain extent, being a masquerade, but ultimately he was truly trying to bring beauty into people's lives. He said he had been to heaven and hell, and that he wanted to create a heaven around him. I passingly wondered why he didn't seem any more interested in the hell he had apparently visited, but I didn't say anything about it at the time. I felt that any further confrontation might be an overstep of my bounds, so I brought the conversation back to our connection. If one of us is an incarnation of the other, how are we both alive, here, at the same time? I asked. He thought for a second, then explained that, according to certain Buddhist belief systems, it is sometimes possible for one soul to go into two bodies, with each body representing a different facet of that being, or at least that's how I understood it. Some of these transcendental topics are hard to talk about due to our lack of understanding and vocabulary, and our limited experience confronting them. His explanation made sense to me, though, because I had already theorized that it might be the case because of the differences in our names. I won't say them here, Dianne, but of course you know what they are. His name represents order, uniformity, organization, while mine represents chaos, contrast, and conflict. This was the part he didn't mention out loud, but I wondered if he was thinking it too because I could sense some malaise in his demeanor. SH was wearing corpse paint, so I decided to ask him about that. He told me that he didn't wear it at every event, that they usually dealt with lighter themes. But since both he and his partner were getting old, and since it was a masquerade and close to Halloween, he had chosen an uncharacteristically dark costume. I told him that maybe it was meaningful that we had met on this particular night, meaning on a night when he was perhaps more open to darkness and nonconformity, but I'm not sure if he knew what I meant. I realized my comment could have just as easily been interpreted as me expecting him to pass the torch on to me or something like that. I didn't want to intimidate or scare him, like I fear I must have done with you, Dianne. I tried to dial back the intensity. I didn't want to come off as aggressive or crazy. There was a pause, and suddenly I saw you in his eyes, Dianne. Maybe it's just because you both have blue eyes, maybe something else, but all of a sudden I was back in your living room, asking why you'd stop talking to me, pleading with you to see me again, to recognize me. Your expression was sympathetic, but you still couldn't talk to me. You couldn't even ask me to leave you alone. I had to force it out of you. Of course you remember all that, so there's no point in me going over it again. Anyway, just for a second, SH reminded me exactly of you, and the next thing I knew, I was crying. I was bawling my eyes out. I had finally met one of my biggest inspirations, Dianne, but I would have rather just been at home with you, watching Netflix and doing nothing. And then I was back, in real time, bawling my eyes out in front of a person who was me in some ethereal, complex way, but also in another way, a perfect stranger. Nikita and SH were just staring at me. They had no idea why I was crying. Of course, I didn't have enough time to explain everything to SH, or enough information to even explain it to myself, for that matter. But I told him that, for a second, he reminded me of my former best friend, that I miss very, very much. And then I hugged him and gave him my painting. He interjected that he wanted to make sure I knew that the painting wouldn't necessarily be put on display. I thought it was funny that after that whole interaction, a part of him still suspected I might just be there for personal gain. I reassured him that no, it was just a gift. It was his, and he could do with it what he liked. I wrote my name on the back because I realized since I hadn't signed it anywhere, he wouldn't remember my name. Then Nikita and I left to experience the rest of the party. I talked to the people running the event in every chance I could get, trying to figure out how exactly this place worked. I found out that some of the workers were volunteers while others were paid interns. Not every one of them lived on the premise, but some of them did, and took care of the grounds on a daily basis. S.H. and his partner lived upstairs in the part that was more like a house and less of a museum. To my disappointment, I couldn't find any of the real paintings. I found out that most of the paintings around were high-quality prints, and the real paintings were being kept in a vault until the Entheon that would be their home would be built. Everyone I talked to seemed sort of suspicious that I was asking so many questions, even though they were all perfectly innocent in my mind at least. It's true I had certain criticisms, but I wasn't about to let any of those show because I still wanted to get involved. I don't remember exactly what question I asked to prompt this response, but one of the volunteers even said, "We're not a cult or anything," defensively, when I hadn't even brought it up. I told her that was too bad because if SH had had a cult, I would be the first to join. The whole experience reminded me of when Nikita, KJ, and I decided to go to the infamous Blue Diner to investigate the validity of rumors we had heard that it was run by a cult. I always imagined that cult members would be eager to talk about their beliefs in order to recruit new members, but the Blue Diner owners seemed strangely guarded and suspicious, even when evidence of their unusual belief system was already all around us, from Bible quotes on the walls to pamphlets on display on the table. I got tired of having to press the volunteers so hard for information I could probably easily find online and didn't want to keep making Nikita wait for me. So we decided to just find a nice place to relax and draw. We found a room with live painters, which had a couch that we settled down on. I felt much better once I started drawing. Ever since you stopped talking to me, I guess I've been trying to find my own style rather than just being like you. Did you know, Dianne, that there's an entire genre of intentionally ugly art that breaks all the rules we were taught about how to make art beautiful and flattering? You outline every tooth, expose every wrinkle, etc. Making ugly art on purpose is harder than you might think. Most of the criticism I get nowadays is that my art isn't actually as ugly as the viewer originally expected it to be. Even with all the unique and novel things around me, I found that all I really wanted to draw was Nikita, the love of my life, sitting right next to me on the couch, in my gaudy, ridiculous style. Nikita graciously posed for me, holding a horrible grimace for an excessively long amount of time, while working on one of her signature abstractions. Apparently the way we had made ourselves at home inspired some of the other guests to do the same. They took seats on the floor, and some of them even took out instruments and started to jam. The whole vibe in the room was suddenly a million times more relaxed and friendlier than it had been a moment ago, to the obvious disdain of certain ones of the guests. One person kept smiling at me. She introduced herself as Z, and said she liked my laugh. I asked her if she wanted to be included in my drawing, and she excitedly agreed. She was hard to draw because she moved around so much, but I accepted the challenge. Her charisma reminded me of Charles Manson and that uncanny ability he always had of making 6 or 7 different facial expressions in under a second. At one point, I noticed Z speaking in complete gibberish to the person next to her. He seemed confused but responded in the same invented language. The whole interaction cracked me up. It was totally surreal and the best thing I'd seen all day. At one point, somebody took out a Tupperware of chocolate, and the group started passing it around and eating it with a spoon. I wondered if the chocolate was spiked with anything, and also wondered if the encounter was going to get sexual. But if that was the intention, it would have to be at somebody's after party, because the security guards came in and suddenly kicked us all out. It was really abrupt. One second, everybody was just lounging around, having a good time, and the next minute, the security guards came in and started herding us all out like cattle. "Okay, party's over," they said. We left the mansion and started heading towards the car when Jay mentioned a bird cage that I hadn't seen in passing. So we went over to check it out before we left. It was so big you could climb on it, made out of painted white metal. It was covered in patterns of birds seen through a kaleidoscope. A face here, a wing there. Outside it was dark and cold and raining, but Nikita and I started climbing on it, lighting it up with the flashlights from our phones. We started mimicking that scene from Withnail and I, where the two main characters go into this fancy tea parlor. Everyone knows they're out of place, and the owner immediately tries to kick them out, calling them drunks, but they insist that instead they are multimillionaires and demand the finest wines known to man. That's how we felt in that mansion, where it seemed everybody knew we were too poor to be there, but we were still having the most fun. We started making a video for SH, announcing to him that we had looked up his net worth and seen that it was $1 billion, and that we intended to purchase him and his entire estate. We'll probably never make it into a real video because I still want him to like me, but we had a lot of fun with it at the time. One of the security guards eventually found us and kicked us off the grounds. And that is the whole story of my encounter with SH. Dianne, I don't know if you'll ever hear this. I can't guarantee that it will reach you. If you do hear it, I know you probably won't respond. Anyway, true to my word, I intend to keep you updated, as if you were still in support of my choices. I contemplate the conundrum of unconditional love a lot these days, Dianne, and whether or not it's healthy to love someone who doesn't reciprocate that love, or at least can't show it in any way. Of course, I hope that one day you'll speak to me again, but experience has taught me not to dwell on these sorts of things. I hope this message finds you well, if it finds you at all. I'm off to bed now because I intend to get up early tomorrow with a nice hot cup of coffee. Dianne, it is 12 o'clock a.m. on November 4th, 2018.